GOP House Budget Chairman Paul Ryan has already said the president's budget ensures debt crisis and decline. He called it failed leadership. So here now for his first TV interview since the president's budget released is House Budget Chair Paul Ryan, Republican from Wisconsin. Mr. Chairman, welcome back as always. I want to talk about some budget details, but let me just get your overview. You're calling it debt crisis and decline. Tell us why.
Well, it's not an America built to last. It's an America drowning in debt, Larry, because it's a fundamentally unserious budget. I mean, the president literally is just punting on the issues. This is really more of a campaign document than a credible fiscal solution to our big budget problems. Look, the president's claiming that this is a $4 trillion deficit reduction package. But, Larry, when you strip out all the accounting tricks and all the budget gimmicks, he's increasing spending by $1.5 trillion and increasing taxes by $1.9 trillion for a measly $400 billion of deficit reduction over a 10-year period where he proposes to spend $47 trillion. So under the status quo, with the debt expected to rise 78%, under this budget it rises 76%. Unserious. And the problem we have, Larry, is at this moment in our history, we're on the verge of our own debt crisis. This is when we need leadership, and it's when we can least afford to have a president who is just walking away from this. It's the fourth year of trillion-dollar-plus deficits with the president's fourth budget, and that's why we say it's just not serious.
Well, okay. What I don't get is he says he's cutting the deficit by $4 trillion, but when you look at the numbers from his own table, the deficit rises $6.7 trillion, and spending rises by $47 trillion. This is over the 10-year window. Right. Now, let me just ask you, inside this, you mentioned this, almost $2 trillion of tax hikes. We referred to this earlier in the show. There's about $350 billion of business tax hikes, of offshore profits tax hikes, and then you got the repeal of the Bush tax cuts. You got payroll tax cut is in here someplace, but everything else, capital gains, dividends, banks, oil and gas companies, millionaires, how can that grow the economy? You're a growth guy. You're a supply sider. I don't understand how that grows the economy.
Well, it doesn't grow the economy because the effective top personal income tax rate goes to 44.8% in 2013. And look, you and I both know, Larry, that 8 out of 10 businesses in America, they file their taxes as individuals, as sub-S's, LLCs, partnerships. So we're going to tax our most successful job creators, where more than half our jobs come from in America, at about 45% next year. You know, overseas, which in Wisconsin means Lake Superior, the Canadians, they're dropping their tax on their businesses to 15%. The Chinese are at 25%. The Irish are at 12.5%. And President Obama is saying we're going to tax all these successful small businesses at about 45%. And even taking these tax increases, just those Bush tax cuts, the top two rates, that pays for something like 12.7% of his deficit spending. The so-called Buffett rule, it only pays for like 6.7% of his deficit spending. So put aside all the economic damage that these tax increases do to capital and business formation and small businesses, it doesn't even come close to paying for his spending binge that occurs over this entire period of time.
Are there any spending cuts, any legitimate spending cuts in this budget?
Well, no, he's spending by $1.5 trillion. So if you take a look at his entire budget package, it's a net spending increase. So no, he's not cutting spending. You have to net these things out. And he's saying, other than, he really cuts defense big time, but the spending increases on domestic spending more than overcompensate these deep cuts to defense. And so it calls for a net increase in spending.
I thought there was like $350 billion of additional so-called stimulus spending in this budget. Yeah. Is that true? Is that hidden? I mean, that's what I think I found.
That's in there. Like I said, a lot of domestic spending increases so that this budget is a net spending increaser.
All right, so let's go back to basics. Let's go back to big picture. You have warned for the last several years, you call yourself a second-generation supply sider. I love that. And you have said that the debt bomb from overspending and the bankrupt entitlements, that the debt bomb is going to turn into a tax hike bomb, and that is going to sink us. I'd like you to elaborate on that and tell me, if you will, what you're going to do about it when you propose your budget in about a month's time.
Right, so all this current borrowing is just tomorrow's tax increases or tomorrow's, inflation. So either we're going to crank up taxes or the Fed's going to monetize. And I don't want to see either of those things happen, because that's the end of American prosperity. That's a managed decline agenda. And the problem is, every time you don't do something to fix this problem, it just gets that much worse. Ask the Greeks. And so what we're going to do, Larry, is we're going to actually propose and pass a budget again. I know that sounds novel these days, but we have a law that says we have to pass a budget by April 15th. The Senate has ignored that law for 2010. They ignored it in 2011. Now they say they're going to ignore it again in 2012. We're not, because we think it's our moral and legal obligation to pass a budget. We're going to pass a budget to get these entitlements under control, to get this debt under control, to keep our debt from getting at these catastrophic levels, and we're going to propose fundamental reform. Broaden the base, lower the rates. Our budget that we passed last year said top rate of 25% for businesses and individuals, a territorial tax system, so we don't get into this repealing deferral and double taxing American companies, and we get rid of all the loopholes and deductions. You can raise the same amount of revenues for the government in a far more pro-growth efficient way, and you'll get a growth dividend, which we don't even count, of more prosperity, more jobs, more upward mobility, and that combined with spending cuts, spending controls, and entitlement reforms dodges the bullet of debt and gets us back on a path to prosperity. That's precisely what we're going to do.
Are you going to come back with a new round of Paul Ryan and now Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon? You're going to propose that as part of your package on Medicare reform, knowing that this is all about election year jockeying. The president's budget is election year political. They'll come after you. Will you put it in your budget again?
I don't know the answer to that, because we haven't written the budget yet, and it's a collaborative effort I write with my colleagues. So I don't know the answer to that question yet. But what Ron Wyden and I were trying to do, we're trying to show that there is room for a bipartisan consensus on how to save and strengthen Medicare, how to keep the guarantee for current seniors, and to have a program that younger people can actually rely on. Because right now, Medicare is making $37 trillion in empty promises to current and future seniors. And the president's law puts this new sort of rationing board in charge of putting price controls on Medicare, which leads to denied care. His budget, the only other spending cut he calls for, which obviously, as I said, is a net spending increasing budget, but his only other spending cut really of significance is just more Medicare rationing, just another 0.5 percentage point by his board for them to decide how to twist the screws on Medicare. We're going to reject that, and we believe that there's a bipartisan consensus emerging here on how to save and strengthen Medicare.
But I want to ask you, okay, you want to slash spending, you want to reform the entitlements and so forth, and yet we had a report earlier tonight, the conference committee on the payroll tax holiday, Republicans off on a $100 billion payroll tax holiday without paying for it. Doesn't that undermine the credibility of the great noble thoughts that you are telling us about?
Well, I think it's really unfortunate that the president and the Senate, remember these are three-way negotiations, and the House Republicans are one. The president and the Senate will not, they insist on no pay for us. They insist on not paying for this thing at all. They're going to pay for what they call the doc fix and the UI. I do have trouble with what you just said, though, actually, because this finances Social Security, and if you don't cover that, then you're just harming the Social Security Trust Fund. So I have a problem with that. But the frustration is not that House Republicans, we paid for this. We passed a payroll tax extension with spending cuts to pay for it. It's the Senate and the White House that literally refuse to do anything such like that. So that's the pickle that we find ourselves in. But the broader issue here, Larry, is we have put out specifics on spending cuts, on entitlement reforms, and tax reforms. The Senate, they're not budgeting. They didn't budget 2 years ago, a year ago. They're not budgeting this year. And the president, for the fourth year in a row, gave us a $1 trillion deficit budget and a budget that literally does not propose to do anything to fix this fiscal crisis, save these entitlement programs, and prevent a debt crisis. And that, to me, is a huge abdication of leadership at a moment in our country's history when we need it so badly.
Let me ask you,